Hey everyone, I'm super excited to share this conversation that I had with Dr. Gary Habermas. Dr. Habermas is a leading researcher in the field of resurrection studies. And as we come across Easter this week, or as we come upon Easter this week, I thought it would be so much fun to sit down with a scholar of Gary Habermas's repute and talk with him about whether or not it's reasonable to actually believe Jesus rose bodily from the dead. Dr. Habermas is completing his magnum opus, a multi-volume set on the resurrection, due out starting next year. And so we talk a little bit about that, and I look forward to reading it. It's going to be a lot of fun once it comes out. At any rate, I pray that this conversation encourages you and puts some muscle on your faith. Gary, it's nice to see you again and get to chat. How are you doing, man?
I am doing splendidly, except for my so many requests for this and that I cannot get to my publishing deadlines. So
Yeah,
I mean, in a way, that's a super blessing. On the other hand, I can't get to my publishing deadline, so it's a
right.
mixture.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I'm honored that you're here. You told me off air a moment ago that past 3 weeks you've had 60 requests for either
Yeah.
interviews, emails, whatever. So yeah, we're honored here. And thanks for hanging out with
Hey,
us.
I'm honored to be on. I took it. I took it, so I must have thought it was a good one.
So Gary, we've known each other for several years and we've talked a lot about the resurrection and the resurrection of Jesus and just resurrection period. And you are the guy on the resurrection. There's like so there's several of you guys. You, Tom Wright, Mike Lacona, William Lane Craig. You guys talk a lot about the resurrection, and so I'd like to focus our talk today on that topic. This episode will be released Easter week or the week leading up to Easter.
Oh, good,
And
good.
so I thought let's have Gary on. Let's chat about the resurrection. But before we get into that, tell the audience a little bit about you, your educational background, particularly your PhD topic, and how that has just opened up a huge ministry for you.
Wow. Well, that's a huge topic because it lasts. I mean, it literally, Mike Lacone asked me about this the other day for something he's doing, and we stopped and counted. And I have been doing this. This is going to sound crazy. I've been doing it for almost 60 years.
Oh wow.
I was, I went into well, I had a long period of doubt, 10 straight years and 10 on and off years for a total of 20. As I've been telling people, I only realized this maybe a year ago. My doubt was bookended by the two most important people in my life dying. At first, the first person who died, my great grandmother. You think, well, how can your great grandmother be the most important person in your life? She was, and everybody in my family knew it. My parents knew it, and they were too happy that we were that close. Well, she died. And I started going into all kinds of doubts, and it settled on my religious faith. And I was a teenager when I started doubting, and I started reading everything. I mean, everything. I was reading Boltman when I was 17 and scared me to death. And so people ask me in talk shows, they'll say, hey, I'll bet you're doing this for altruistic reasons because you know it's going to help people with doubt. And my answer is, well, I knew that would happen later. At that time, I didn't know it would happen later, but it has happened later. But no, I'm not that altruistic. I was doing it because I couldn't stand the doubt. I couldn't stand not knowing. And one day I was reading a book that had a very simple paragraph that said if Jesus was raised from the dead, Christianity would be true, because otherwise, why would God raise him? And I thought, wow, well, my friends were sending me to, I won't say silly things, but for my questions, they didn't come up very high on the chart. And they were saying, read this, read that. How about this topic? How about that? And I thought, well, those are good, but they don't answer my questions. And then when I read that paragraph, that did it.
Hmm.
And I realized that if Christ is raised from the dead, everything else is anchored to it. And my doubt ended just a handful of years before my wife and mother of my 4 children died of stomach cancer. So that's the other bookend. So I got into it for my own doubts. And now if it's helping people, I'm overjoyed, but I can't say that's why I started.
Hmm. Yeah. And then tell us a little bit about your doctoral work and the project that you focused on
Uh,
that eventually led to your PhD.
okay, well, I did my PhD in the Middle Ages, 1975, and in those days, at least at my school, Michigan State, they weren't like the schools today that generally have 3-man doctoral committees. Uh, I had 6 people on my committee. And as far as I could tell, you didn't ask people direct questions, but as far as I could tell, 3 of them believed in the resurrection and 3 of them did not. And it was very balanced. I had a Jewish historian on my committee. He was the most complimentary guy of my dissertation.
Hmm.
And when it was over, you get a kick out of this, your folks will. He handed me the dissertation back and he goes, I like it. He goes, but I think you left out the chief evidence for the resurrection. And I'm thinking 2 things shot into my mind immediately. What have I left in my whole life of studying? And number 2, why are you, a Jewish non-Christian historian, suggesting this? And I said, so what did I leave out? And he said, you said nothing about the Shroud of Turin.
Oh, that's interesting.
It is interesting on a
Yeah.
bunch of grounds
Hmm.
that he would even care about it. And, but so the committee was good. They were very complimentary. They did not have me add a sentence to my dissertation. And I didn't think I was going to get through. I thought they're going to be really super, super tough, but they had me leave the room and they discussed it. They invited me back in. I was all nerved up. And the director said, thank you for stepping back in here, Dr. Habermas. And I thought, oh my, I can't believe it.
That's a good
So
sign.
yeah, that was a great sign.
And now your project specifically, your dissertation, which essentially became your life's work, that's
Yeah.
culminating in a magnum opus that you're currently working on. We'll talk about that in a few as well. But the essential thrust of your work is that, okay, if the Bible is true, if it's inerrant, let's just take the top notch here. If it's inerrant, then you need to believe in the resurrection. If the New Testament is not inerrant, but it's still historically reliable, you should still believe in the resurrection. And so kind of work with kind of take us through those steps. I mean, it seems obvious that if the Bible is inerrant, if it's you know completely inerrant, then you would have to believe in the resurrection because the Bible
Sure.
speaks of it. But how could it be the case that if the Bible's not inerrant, okay, if it's just a historical document, if the New Testament writings particularly, why should a person still believe that Jesus rose from the dead?
I'll add one more step to your 2 steps. I'll add a third one.
Okay.
And I frequently do this when I'm in lectures, especially state universities. And I hold up a New Testament that I brought to the school, and I'll say, if this book is inerrant, Jesus is raised from the dead. If this book is not inerrant, it's reliable to some level, a lower or higher mid-range level. I'm going to argue that Jesus is still raised from the dead. But for you here tonight who are skeptics and atheists, if the Bible is unreliable, if there's almost nothing we can know from the Bible, I'm here to tell you tonight that Jesus is raised from the dead. And so I think that kind of is a tension grabber. And so what I've been doing for these 4 volumes that you're calling, my magnum opus, volume 1 is a volume on evidence. I just turned it in, and the printed pages are just short of 1,100 pages. And it took that long to spread the evidence. And here's the key. I used evidence the way critics used evidence. At no point did I ever argue the Bible is true because the Bible says so. That's ridiculous. Not ridiculous as a statement, but ridiculous that I would try to convince anybody by arguing that way. It doesn't work. So I'm using this lowest common denominator argument that I can just use a dozen facts, which I cut down to 6. And those 6 are what I call the minimal facts. And I think you can show that without any question that the resurrection is the best possibility for those 6 facts than any other solution.
And
And
these six minimal facts are facts that every historian, whether confessional or non-Christian historian, would assent to, right? That's why you
yeah,
call them the minimal facts. Like, these are the minimal
yeah,
facts
yeah,
we all
yeah.
agree to. So
And
what are the?
when
Yeah.
I say these guys accept it, I don't mean, oh, you've got to be wrong, because if almost everybody accepts these guys, how about the dozens of people I've read who don't even believe Jesus existed? And I go, time out, time out. You're talking about people who may live in their parents' house. They call themselves they call themselves Bible scholars. They haven't been to school. How they picking this up on their own, and they don't believe Jesus exists. But the real scholars, the New Testament atheists, don't give those guys the time of day. In fact, Bart Ehrman, the well-known New Testament atheist, he said, those people, the mythers, he said, they're mad that we don't give them attention and praise their little books, their ebooks or whatever they are. We don't praise them. And they're ticked at that. He said, but I want to tell you something. We don't read them because they're not scholars, and they say a bunch of things, which I think he calls laughers, a lot of laugh comments. And he says they think they have scholarship on their side. He says they don't have scholarship on their side. He said they don't have a foothold. They don't even have a toehold on the data. No, I'm talking about guys who they have to be scholars in a related field. That'd be like yourself. I mean, New Testament theology, history, classics, philosophy, archaeology. There are some people with PhDs in archaeology. Uh, those would all be relevant fields from this time period. And then they have to be specialists with that background working in this area. They're the people I'm surveying, and they're the ones who agree to the historicity of the 6 facts, almost without exception.
Right. So, and so the question becomes, what do you do with the six facts? Like, what's the interpretation of the 6 data points, right? So
Yeah,
that's where the differences will be, of course, between, say, an atheist New Testament scholar or an agnostic and a confessional scholar like yourself. But what is not in dispute, the facts are not in dispute, the 6 minimal facts. So can you
correct.
kind of give us a rundown? What are those 6 facts that every scholar
Sure,
or a vast majority of scholars will believe in? Can you give us a rundown of those?
sure. I'll do it real quickly.
Yeah.
Jesus died by crucifixion, and this one is just as well accepted as crucifixion. I mean, there are two of the, I'd say, along with preaching the kingdom of God, these are the 3 best things we know about Jesus. The second one is the disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. They had a real experience, which in their interpretation was Jesus risen. Thirdly, these data were preached very, very early. How early? Well, Garrett Ludeman passed away just not too long ago, but atheist New Testament scholar Garrett Ludeman said this message was preached, and his word is immediately. In fact, one scholar wrote an article a few years ago and said this idea that whatever their experiences were, they started being preached immediately. He said it is a baseline given from critical theologians today. It was published in a major New Testament journal. In fact, I think it was a Journal of New Testament Studies. But okay, that's 3. Crucifixion, experiences early. 4, they turned the world upside down. Their lives were transformed, sometimes to the point of dying, sometimes just to the point of being beat up, sometimes just to the point of leaving their families and businesses and traipsing around the world because they were so committed that they were called to preach the gospel. A few of them did die as martyrs. We have first century statements for the martyrdoms of 3 of the 4 best known ones: James, the brother of Jesus, Peter, and Paul. And John's the other one. And so we have martyrdom comments for 3. They were 3 of the 4. They were sold out. And 4 and 5 are the 2 individuals: James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul, the skeptic, who was going across the countryside bringing in men and women. He never said he killed them, but he said, I testified against them to their deaths. So I guess that means he gave one of the major testimonies that got him killed. Those six, you will have to look hard to find anybody who disagrees with any of them.
Right. And so what are the basis what basis do these people have for believing these six minimal facts if they don't believe the Bible is, say, inerrant? Like, is it they're using, tell the audience like the data that or how they're getting their data. Is it are they
But
they're
these are
still yeah, so I guess what I'm getting at is like, okay, so let's just assume that the Bible's not inspired by any means, and it's still reliable, it seems, for as a historical document of what was going on in the first century, right? These even secular scholars, atheistic, agnostic scholars, still look to the New Testament as historical artifacts that we can use to discover something about the early Christian movement. That's correct,
They
right?
do. Yeah, what they do is, here's a good example. Bart Ehrman says the Gospels are not reliable. And then he turns around for his whole book, Did Jesus Live? And he tells you a whole bunch of things in Jesus' life that are reliable, and either they happened or something very like them happened. For example, he says one of the best known rules that New Testament scholars, as well as historians, use, multiple facts, independent multiple facts, is a great measure of whether something happened. And Bart Ehrman lists 15 sources within 100 years of Jesus' death, which is his period of historicity, 100 years in the ancient times. He says he's got 15 sources, Christian and non-Christian, for the death of Jesus by crucifixion. He says it's not questioned at all. By the way, that earlier fact I mentioned, the disciples being transformed, it was Bart Ehrman who said, after they had these real experiences and after they began preaching them, his phrase was, they turned the world on its ear. That's pretty cool. I mean, that's a pretty good phrase for what transformation is. So what these guys do is they'll start with Paul, and they think Paul is the number one New Testament scholar. There's a real easy reason for that. They don't think any apostles wrote the four Gospels. I'm talking about the real skeptical guys. The middle of the road moderates will give you, I understand from New Testament scholars that Mark, maybe even Mark from Peter on Mark, and Luke are pretty much givens. But Luke and John are more questioned. But what they'll so they don't know that about the Gospels, so they go to Paul because they know they can trust Paul. And what they'll do is, of the 13 books that bear Paul's name, they will grant the historicity of 7 of those books. And I tell my PhD students, it's interesting because the 7 books they grant are the 7 you would use if you're giving a series on who was the Apostle Paul. And those 7 are Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. No, so there's your start to your question. We'll give you those 7 epistles. And if you pulled something from those 7 epistles, if we don't believe it, at least we say you're within your rights to use it because it's from a really good source. So they'll give you those 7 by Paul. That's a good start. Then you got Ehrman, who pulls all kinds of facts out of the Gospels, which he says are unreliable, but you still know all these things. And so when you start doing this, how many are multiply attested? How many of them have likely authors? When you start doing this, you get a long list of facts. And those 6 are among the ones they grant. So even if it's not reliable, as Ehrman says, even if it's not reliable, you have enough data to stand on. And a lot of these guys will tell me, I accept all Habermas's 6 facts, but it's what you do with them that's important. And I'll say, well, great. Now, what do you do? What do you do with them? And they'll go, well, I don't know. What do you want me to do? And I'll go, well, pick a naturalistic theory. If you don't think it happened, pick a natural, and they will almost never pick a naturalistic theory. And this is changing significantly. It's one of the things I found out. They will seldom pick a naturalistic theory, but they will even more seldom pick one theory and only one theory and stick to it, so that if they're disproven, they're wrong. And that's why they won't do it, because they know you are armed. It's like you're covered with 20 weapons on your body, and you're going to use whichever one you need if they come at you. and you're going to use them against their one. And if they lose that one, the world will know they don't have a basis for what they're saying. So they generally, I mean, some of the main guys who only chose one theory, two of them just died. Garrett Ludeman and John Shelby Spong just died in the last couple of years. So they're not around anymore. And one of the other guys who just died, E.P. Sanders of Oxford and Duke universities, Sanders says in one of his books that the naturalistic theories are no good. They've been refuted. He calls himself a liberal. And then he says, however, these theories just don't work. They're baloney. So
yeah, and E.P.
that's the way it
Sanders,
goes.
as every Pauline scholar will tell you, E.P. Sanders was a pretty important scholar.
It's what?
Every New Testament scholar will tell you that E.P. Sanders was a very important scholar this
Oh
past
yeah, he
century,
changed
right?
the whole.
Yeah.
He and his co-author changed the whole world from Boltzmann over to the Third Quest.
There,
He's the bridge between Boltzmann's dominance for 50. Well, Barth's in there too. So Boltzmann's, let's say Boltzmann was in charge for 20 years, pretty much. Sanders changed Barth's Hellenistic take on the New Testament to the Third Quest Jewish take on the New Testament. That was Sanders.
so essentially, this is why you call it the minimal facts, is because we're going to use minimal sources. You're saying to yourself, okay, I'm going to look at only the sources that say the skeptics are going to use.
Yep.
I'll play that gameplay by those rules, and then let's see where we get. And you're saying that those sources will give you the minimal facts that everybody can attest to. Then you just named them. And the only reasonable explanation, the best explanation you might say, is of those minimal facts, is that Jesus rose from the dead.
That's my point. Yeah.
So we've played this game a lot of times. We've done it, in public settings and things of like that.
You did it at your house one night.
Yeah, we were. Yeah, that's right.
Where your elders and a couple other people were firing all kinds of doubts.
Yeah. So for the listeners, Gary was over at my house several years ago, and with just a group of guys, and we were just hanging out and chatting, and we kind of play this game. Matt gets to be the skeptic, and Gary gets to win him to Christ, kind of thing. So
it was fun. It was a good night.
Yeah, we did that at the lecture you gave at church. I remember that too. So this is, every time we get together, we sort of play this game. So we're gonna play the game now.
Oh, we are? Okay.
Let's do it. So I'm gonna push back. Let me play skeptic here. I'm gonna push back and say, okay, maybe Jesus only seemed to die, right? What's wrong with that? Maybe he just got knocked out. Maybe, and then his appearances later, weren't all that extraordinary because he never died in the first place. What's wrong with that argument?
Okay, this is called variously either the swoon or the apparent death theory for the listeners. And first of all, I'll tell you, of the critics out there, you can't name, of the sharpest guys who work in this narrow area, the Ludemans and the Ehrmans, and you probably can't name 5 published scholars. I can only go by the published scholars. I can't tell who does it in private, but you probably can't name 5 of them who hold that theory. And well, let me just start with a comment. That'll give some refutations. John Dominic Crossan, who's as well known as a skeptic as anybody, and then Marcus Borg, who passed away a few years ago, co-founders of the Jesus Seminar, who reject up to 91% of Jesus's so-called red letter sayings. John Dominic Crossan says, it's pretty close to a quote. He says, I take it absolutely for granted that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. And Borg's comment, you would think they wrote the two together because it's almost a twin. So here you got two of the best skeptics in the world. Bart Ehrman would say the same thing. Absolutely for granted. So here's what you got to ask. Why do they think swoon does not have a chance? If they think swoon doesn't have a chance, and many, many others don't, it must not, because these guys are very, very skeptical. Okay, here's some of the things I would say. First of all, myself and 2 friends, one of them a medical student finishing his MD, and he's got a PhD for medical school, because we need him in this group. We published an article about a year or so ago in a medical journal on the cause of Jesus's death. Now, we didn't argue that a certain cause had to be it, but all we gave was a head count of medical people. And asphyxiation was chosen about 2-to-1 over all the other theories combined. Take all the other theories and double it, and that's asphyxiation. Now, the key to asphyxiation is you don't have to have a medical degree. You don't have to have an EKG or an EEG. The centurion doesn't have to know anything. He just has to let the guy hang on the cross. And the asphyxiation theory, if it's true, not everybody says it is that when you slump down low in the cross, you asphyxiate. So you can't do it. You start losing your consciousness and you can't breathe. You push up. When you push up, you take these big gulps of air, and that's when you cuss people out. Or, the two guys on each side of Jesus, they were saying all kinds of things to the people. And that's when you do it. You push up and you let them have it, and you slump back down because it hurts to stand up like that. And you start asphyxiating again. All the centurion has to know, you go, well, how can they broke the ankles of the two guys on either side of Jesus and he left Jesus alone? Did the disciples pay him off? No, because he'd have to deal with Pilate. So first of all, the disciples weren't allowed. They ran away. But if Pilate sees you hanging in the low position for a long time, let's say a half hour, and not pushing up, you're dead. You can't fake, on the asphyxiation view, you cannot fake death by asphyxiation. So they came to him, and then it says to make sure they did not break his ankles, but he instructed one of his legionnaires to stab him in the chest with a spear. And you go, but that's only in John. Okay, cool. Why is it that Raymond Brown, James D.G. Dunn, and C.H. Dodd, three of the very sharpest New Testament guys of the last generation, all three of them take a stand for the spear wound? Why? Well, one reason is we have a Roman source, Quintilian, who tells us the centurion, when they take the crucifixion, the dead body of the crucifixion victim, they take him down, and a family comes to, before they throw him in a pit, if a family wants the body, he has one of his men strike the body one last time. Now, the word for strike in Latin is a military term, and it means to hit with an axe, a spear, or a sword, to strike the body. So the dead body's lying in the ground, the family wants it, and they've got to strike where they know they won't strike the knee. These soldiers are gonna put their weapon somewhere that they know will kill the guy. So what I'm saying here is that the centurion did to Jesus precisely what Quintilian said the centurion to do after they got him down, but the centurion did it when he was still hanging there at the end. All right, so we got two things going here. Death by asphyxiation, you don't fake it. All right, so you do fake it. You barely make it. Nobody knows and we only have a couple cases of people who got down off the cross out of thousands of people. If I'm not mistaken, Josephus said they crucified 500 a day. So thousands of people died. All right, so they take him down. Let's say he's breathing very shallowly and they don't know he's alive. So he has his man in Quintilian strike the guy. On the cross, they stab him in the chest. Okay, if you happen to make it breathing very shallowly and you're in a coma, I think that spear wound to the chest will break you out of your reverie. It would end it. But here's the third and major problem. There's many others, but here's the three major ones. Third is a critique by the German skeptic David Strauss in 1864, when he wrote his Life of Jesus for the German People. He said, the problem with the swoon theory, which is probably the most popular theory at that time, and up to maybe 1850, he said the problem with the theory is if Jesus struggled out of the tomb on Sunday morning, here's his problems. 1, he didn't die. 2, he's got to move the stone. 3, if you believe in the guard, skeptics don't. If you believe in the guard, he's got to get past him. 4, he's got to limp to where the disciples are. How far away would they be? I don't know, quarter mile?
It'd be a distance.
Pardon?
It'd be a distance for a beat up man.
For a basically dead man.
Yeah.
He'd have to walk there. And Strauss said, what's he say when he gets to the door? He's holding his side. He hasn't washed his hair. He's soaked with sweat and blood in his clothes, and he puts up his hand and he says, "I told you I would rise again from the dead." And to make a long story short, I don't doubt that the disciples would say God healed him. God didn't. We believe medicine. They would say God healed him. But I'll tell you what, he's alive, but he isn't risen. This is not our definition of risen.
Mm.
And then Andrew over in the corner says, "Oh boy, someday I'm going to have a resurrection body just like his." It doesn't work. So they would have to nurse him back to health. Who knows where he died, what he did, but they'd have to nurse him back. One thing they would know is that he wasn't raised. And this is called the Strauss critique. And today, when skeptics are telling you why they don't believe in the swoon theory, Dominic Crossan talks about asphyxiation. That's about as far as he goes. Asphyxiation is enough for him. But you've got a spear wound and a guy who could not possibly be risen, but alive. Those three things, pardon the pun, but those things kill the swoon theory. I got a bunch of other reasons too, but those three are the knockout punches. And virtually nobody takes it for, I mean, like Crossan, just asphyxiation. One of them does it for most people. You got all three, they seem almost closed case with any of them.
I'm reminded of something that N.T. Wright mentioned one time in addressing this question. He said, "No, the Romans knew how to kill people, right?" And just
who said that?
N.T. Wright.
N.T. Wright did, yeah.
And I think that's a pretty good response. I mean, the Romans were professional killers; they knew what they were doing, and so yeah. The other thing too is, you know, what's the evidence in the first century? You know, with respect to Jesus's death. I mean, it seemed overwhelming that everybody thought he died, right? So the idea that he could have swooned out of the tomb, or looked dead, or was only quote partially dead, or something like that, that just seems kind of to fly in the face of what we know from the first century, namely that no,
Yeah.
people thought he died, right?
Yeah.
So if that's not a good objection, just moving on, suppose we could entertain another objection. Okay, he died. We'll grant that. We'll go with all this, with what everybody's saying, even the most skeptical people saying that, yeah, he died. We'll concede that fact.
Yeah.
But let's suppose the disciples made it all up, right? Let's suppose that they had something to gain from the idea, the belief that Jesus rose from the dead. What's wrong with that argument, with that critique?
You can start almost anywhere, but it's probably now. Are you going to say they stole the body too, or are you not going to put that in there?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, they made it up. Let's say they stole the body as well, just to kind of.
And they lied.
Yeah, and they lied.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Where are you going to start? First of all, there's virtually nobody today who will take that theory. No skeptic. And it's been held by virtually nobody since a German named Hermann Samuel Reimarus in 1765. Nobody's held it. Like every once in a while, somebody plays with it. Richard Carrier has a little essay where he goes, "Well, why not? You can play with this," but it's not his theory. He doesn't like it. So the fact that nobody takes it, if no skeptic takes it, none, there's reasons why nobody takes it. The main one is still, the main comeback is the famous phrase we use: liars don't make martyrs. The guys who stole the body, and you can leave that out, no, let's not say they stole the body. Let's just say they just lied. But the guys who stole the body cannot be the guys that give their life for this and go in the same town over and over again. And someone says, "Well, you can't read their minds. You don't know if they thought they were going to be beat up when they went in there." And I go, "I'm not reading their minds. I'm reading their feet. If they go in the same geographical region or into the same town where they were already beaten up once, probably you don't go there again unless you're really revved up to really think you're preaching for the Lord." Now, how does that belief come when you've stolen the body? Now, what did you do with it? Anyway, but liars don't make martyrs is a huge problem for that view. In fact, it is one of the theories that has a one-punch knockout. And the one-punch knockout is, a lot of the theories, you have a lot of punches and you knock the theory down. Hallucination is an example. But a one-punch knockout is The guys who take the body cannot be the guys who are transformed, who, and some among them, we know they died. Bart will say, well, we only know a few of them died. Great, let's talk about the ones we know died. Peter, James, Paul, the most influential guys of all time. Okay, a couple other problems. If they stole the body and lied, what brings James to the faith? Jesus' brother. Third problem. What brings Paul to the faith years later? He's walking to Damascus, and all of a sudden it hits him. Wow, those guys could have stolen the body, and Jesus is alive, and I'm going to live the rest of my life for him, and then I'll die as a martyr for him. Those things are just they're highly anti. Each one is the opposite of the other one, and you got to pull off about 4 of those to account for Paul's conversion. So you got the liars don't make martyrs. You got James, Paul. There's 3 right there. So if we had 3 for swoon, there's 3 I would use for stolen body, and there are many others for stolen body.
Yeah, liars don't make martyrs, you'd say. So is it fair to say that a lot of people die for a lie, but nobody knowingly dies for their lie, right? Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, you could say a lot of people die for a lie, and they know it's a lie. But nobody, let's see if I get this right. There's guys who would say this very eloquently. There's a sentence that's said about this, but nobody dies for something that is a lie, but they totally believe it to be true. You don't, did I say that right? Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they don't die for a lie that they know is true.
Correct.
That they, yeah, I get what you're saying. That they
They'd
know
have
is
to
actually
be
a lie.
mistaken.
Right.
But how could they be mistaken if they're the ones that stole the body?
Correct. Yeah, it's a contradiction. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a number of like psychological defenses here, like
Yep.
kind of what we're talking about here. But one piece here, and I know this is something that many people talk about, but it's important for the audience to hear this part too, is that there's a theological objection here, is that early Jews weren't necessarily anticipating an individual resurrection. They were
Absolutely.
anticipating, they were anticipating a general resurrection at the end of time, but as N.T. Wright says, not the resurrection of one person in the middle of time.
And not the Messiah.
Not the Messiah. Right.
That's 2 points.
So
and
if they were going to make something up, this probably wouldn't be it. This is not how they would have thought.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, that's good stuff. There's all kinds of things. Okay. When I went through these 6 minimal facts, the second volume, which has been was turned in about 2.5 weeks ago. The second volume is all naturalistic theories. To my knowledge, nobody spends as much time on naturalistic theories in print as Mike Licona, who spends just short of 250 pages. The next book is Mike's and my co-authored book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. And if you count the endnotes, it's almost 100 pages against the naturalistic theories. The book I just turned in is all naturalistic theories, and it's over 1,000 pages. It's probably the longest treatment. Oh, here's the point I'm trying to make. Of the 6 facts, every time you want to list evidences for those 6 facts that go against the naturalistic theories, keep in mind, I'm not using reasons that evangelicals cite, because they cite an errant or almost an errant book, and they get these facts. I argue the way critics argue. Right. And each one of the facts, I have an average. I just did this the other day. I have an average of 14 refutations of each thing that can be brought up. It's like 13.9 of each one that can be brought up. And you got to keep in mind, they don't come from people who quote the Bible and say, therefore it's true. They come from the John Dominic Crosses, Marcus Borg, Z.P. Sanders. Well, Sanders isn't even that strong, not like these guys. Bart Ehrman and Garrett Ludeman. They're the guy. I prefer to use those guys. They're easier to use those guys because people realize if you're using them, whoa, if they say you can get by with this, I guess you can get by with it, that kind of thing. But 14 evidences apiece. So when I give you 3 for swoon and 3 for stolen body, that's 3 out of an average of 14. I got, some of these are major and some of them are minor, but you got a bunch more waiting in the wings for each one of these refutations.
Somebody might push back. I can envision perhaps a very conservative Christian pushing back and say, well, you don't need to give up the inerrancy of the Bible to make this case for the resurrection. And but it's interesting. Tell me what you think about this. I mean, the resurrection was a story that was told, a message that was proclaimed before the New Testament was canonized, right?
Right.
And so your method of kind of bypassing the whole inerrancy question, or even inspiration question, right, is pretty much at home in the first century because they didn't have the New Testament canon at all to when they but
Yes.
yet they were still proclaiming the resurrection. And why do you think is that even an important point to make? I've heard Dan Wallace talk a little bit about the question of, this question of inerrancy, and basically saying, look, I'm not going to lose my faith if the Bible turns out not to be inerrant, which I think would be shocking to many evangelical Christians. But essentially, your method sort of would definitely allow for that. Like, yeah,
I think your point is brilliant, Matt. Your point that the way I'm arguing right now is the way the apostles would have to argue before the Gospel of Mark was written.
Mm-hmm.
So if Mark is 60, which is pretty early, I think Urban says 60, 65. Let's say 60, 70. Let's say 60. That kind of inerrancy, inspiration, how good is the text argument? You don't get all these facts from Paul's epistles. So you kind of have to start with the Gospels because they tell the story of the crucifixion. And the initial appearances. And by the way, the strongest single appearance is the appearance to the 12. It is the one that is, everybody agrees to that. It is the one that is singly attested by the most reasons and the most sources. So, but you have to get to Mark, who doesn't even have appearances. So now you got to get to Matthew. Now it's going to bother some people. I'll let you tell the people who are nervous that I said you don't have. Most scholars think that Mark's gospel ends at chapter 16, verse 8. So the appearances now are going to go to Matthew, which critics usually date about 80 to 85. 30 to 85 is 50 to 55 years. That's a long time to wait. So up until that time, what you're saying is they have to argue the way I'm arguing.
That's what I find fascinating about your argument. I've always loved your argument, but I find that really fascinating, for that reason. I mean, because I think there's a lot of I don't get into apologetics that much anymore, but and partly I think because sometimes apologetics can come across a little cheap. You know what I mean?
It's sometimes what?
It comes across a little cheap. A lot of Christian apologetic approaches to defending the faith. In other words, what I'm saying is that there's a lot of apologetic arguments out there that just don't do the job, at least even to my satisfaction as a Christian. And I think that's why I love your argument, is because you're getting back down to the bare bones of what that ancient or the first century proclamation was all about. And that's why it's important to bring in those perhaps psychological explanations that we were talking about. Get into the psyche of the first Christians. Like, why were they willing to die for things like this, right? And it was tell me your comment on this. When I read 1 Corinthians 15, there's a little creed there in 1 Corinthians 15 that's very important. Paul makes a statement in that chapter, though, where he says, look, our faith is in vain if Jesus didn't rise from the dead. And I think that's a very important statement, because if I were making up a new religion, quote unquote, a new movement, and I based that entire movement upon the veracity of the physical resurrection of a person, I wouldn't. That wouldn't make sense. If I was going to do that, I would base it on maybe a feeling or flutter in my heart, not something that's in the real world. You know what I mean? It would do something like, "Hey, I had this vision one night, and God told me that we're all wrong, so follow me," because that's a subjective experience that can't be put to test. But a physical resurrection implies an empty tomb, implies appearances, perhaps, right? And that's why I find Paul's statement there so fascinating. What would you have to say about that? Like, the central point being the central point of the Christian faith being the resurrection. How important is that in this?
How about this one? I'm glad this point came after our earlier one.
Yeah.
I said the critics will almost never, seldom enough will they pick a theory, but almost never will they pick only one theory and stick with it. And some of the main ones died in the last couple of years. There's almost no, I'm a real well-known guy who takes one of the, because they're afraid if you get after them and disprove it, They can't then say, oh, no, 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 let me check this other one, because you look really, really bad at a debate, and everybody starts saying the Christian looks like the right one here. Okay. Paul is doing what the skeptics won't do. Paul is picking a theory. Paul is saying, yeah, this guy truly, truly died. That's 15 verse 3. He truly died. Let me tell you what happened afterwards. He was raised from the dead. Now, what Paul's saying is, it's not swoon, it's not hallucination, it's not stolen body. He did what Bart Ehrman won't do. Bart Ehrman said in a recent book, I won't pick a naturalistic theory anymore. Paul picked a supernatural theory and was willing to stand on it. And darn, Paul, good job. All the evidence stands with you. You couldn't have known that in those days. You knew some evidence, but look at all we're finding out with multiple attestation and the criteria in the New Testament, what points to this and enemy attestation and embarrassment and all this kind of stuff. Paul didn't work with that stuff, but he boldly said, I'll take one theory. He was raised from the dead and we'll be raised too.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I think, and I've studied a lot of Paul's interpretations of the Old Testament, and
Sure
there's a hermeneutic that I've detected I put this in my book, and especially Romans 4. Paul interprets the Abraham story with a resurrection hermeneutic, and that's important, I think, because it shows just how important the resurrection was to him. It not only changed his life, but it changed his hermeneutic, right? And that's
Good
just
point.
that's
Yeah,
another
425, right?
Yeah, he essentially retells the Abraham story Christologically, right? And I'm trying to think Paul's thoughts after him here, and
Yeah.
that's not the only place. Like the resurrection, it was groundbreaking, I think, as an event for him, and which when you consider his not only skeptical previous life, but he wasn't just a skeptic. I mean, he was an enemy, right? I mean, he was someone who saw the Christian movement as a heresy that he wanted to squelch out. So something had to change his mind, and the Christophany that he experienced on Damascus Road was very important, very important. I would say I just got two more questions, and then I'll let you go. Let's get real practical, maybe perhaps pastoral here. This Easter, what should Christians take away from the resurrection story? In other words, how does it help us today? I mean, we know it paves the way for our resurrection at the end of time and so forth. But what about today? Like, how does it help us navigate the craziness of our strange world?
Yeah, and I think it's especially good at this. First of all, an intro comment, the resurrection is related to almost every major area of theology in the New Testament. 300 verses on the resurrection, New Testament. And those 300 verses are related to almost every major doctrine. Most of all, the gospel doctrine of the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Totally. But a lot of other stuff too. First Thessalonians and the stuff about Jesus' return. And so therefore, comfort one another with these words. Talk about practical. Start right there. I'll go backwards. What about when a loved one dies? Believers and unbelievers are sad. Paul says we grieve too. But here's the difference. We are not like those who grieve and don't have hope. Now, you and I have both done a number of funerals, and I was a pastor for years. An unbeliever's funeral is a lot different than a believer's funeral. Now, critics can say, the believers they're just hoodwinked. Okay, great. Well, now we're back to you. Then you fight yourself through this maze and why it couldn't have happened. But Paul says the resurrection gives us a hope that even when we bury our mother, our father, our child, our brother, our sister, our spouse, when we bury that kind of person, knowing they're going to live forever gives us an incredible peace. So I'll go back to that one at the beginning. The one that's said to be true, the teaching for today, that is said to be true more than any other teaching in the New Testament, almost 20 times in the New Testament, we will be raised like him. Jesus said it, Paul said it, John said it. John says, I like his words, we shall see him as he is and we shall be like him. The New Testament hope is that we will be raised like Jesus. And the reason the resurrection is worth it, if you want to get right down to it, we can be as selfish as we want to, but the reason it's so important is because it is the reason we will be raised together. And that's an important point. Paul actually tells us, that we will be raised corporately and we will all be together. He tells us that he says, you will be raised and we will be raised together with you. Now, that's interesting because the Jewish view was the resurrection would happen as a unit. The whole nation would be raised together. Paul kind of incorporates that with Christians a little bit. He knows they die at different times, but he said, we will be raised together and share with you in heaven. So what you got right there is life after death, eternal life after death, and sharing the part of our existence that we probably value the most, the sharing. That's all guaranteed by the resurrection. And wait, no, sorry, I forgot to put my phone away. But that's just two right there. That
Sure.
we'll be raised and we'll be able to fellowship together. And you got the third one that I already gave. We have hope at funerals. We have hope. But if you line up all the things that are true, Paul ties the meaning of the cross to the resurrection. Justification in Romans 4:25 is tied to the resurrection. In 1 Corinthians 8, it seems like he's recast a creed. He's repeated a creed that brings Jesus into the Shema. And the God of the Shema is the Father, and the Lord of the Shema is Jesus. And that's an 8:6. Well, that's only 7 chapters before the resurrection of Jesus. Paul knows about the resurrection in his mind when he copies that creedal, almost like two members of the Trinity. And Oscar Coleman, the famous creedal author, who talks about the early creeds and how early they are, he says there are no Trinitarian creeds, but there are a bunch of creeds that prefigure the Trinitarian, like baptizing them in the name singular of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. What is it? End of 2 Corinthians, where he uses all 3 members again. To me, that's kind of Trinitarian, but Coleman says it's the beginning of the Trinity. So now you've got some of our most important doctrines. Just a second.
Oh, you're good.
That was my research assistant. I told him to take a hike. I didn't tell him. I turned on the phone and turned it off. So my apologies there too. I know
no, it's
what
good.
you're gonna have
good.
to cut out. But you could go down the line and you can get a list of, like, say, a dozen. I've got a little book I wrote years ago that lists about a dozen doctrines that follow from the resurrection. So
that's good.
I would tell people, here's the biggest thing the resurrection gives us: the yellow brick road. It tells us what we should be doing now and where we will end up, i.e., in the Emerald City. So I used to say it a lot more than I say it now, but I'll say, therefore, follow the yellow brick road. Follow the yellow brick road. And all the way through that tale in Wizard of Oz, the theme is something like this: don't throw those apples back at those mean apple trees that are thrown at us. Just we got a job to do. Keep going. Whoa, look at that big guy on the right with the axe. He looks like he could cut us to pieces. No, we're going to go over and help him. He's going to be a friend of ours. Let's keep moving. Here's the darkest part of the woods. And of course, we have the darkest parts of lives. And this is the area where there are lions and tigers and bears. And I do this in a church, and the little kids in the church go, oh my, when they do it. And here comes this lion. And we get through that because we have to follow the yellow brick road. But the hardest thing is when we come out and see the Emerald City and there's poppies in between and everybody's going to sleep. Well, now you learn another theme. When someone falls down and goes to sleep, the others have to come over and help them up. So now you got this corporate body that we call the church that has to help people that are in pain, and you all get everybody through it, and you get safely to the Emerald City. It's such a great picture, but it's that road that you have to stay on. And the resurrection says, don't wander off of it, stay on it. But along the way, you've got all these other doctrines flushing in. So it's the key to everything in the New Testament.
I feel like a moment ago, I said that that Paul's hermeneutic was changed by the resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think that our hermeneutic needs to be changed by the resurrection of Jesus. And when I say hermeneutic, I don't merely mean how we read the Bible, although that's important, but I also mean how we interpret life. right? When we face life's challenges, like you were saying, that we approach that and interpret that with a fresh, Christological, resurrection focused understanding where we can look at even death and say, where is your sting? Right. So I think there's a lot of
Yeah.
pastoral perspective here.
And
Yeah.
that's biblical too. Where's
Yeah.
your sting? And I tell
Yeah.
people, that's not poetry. That's
Mm.
not, oh, death, where's your sting? Where's your victory? As Paul says, I mean, as Tom Wright says, he says, Paul's trash talking death there. He's trash talking the devil. And that made the resurrection made Paul so bold and so
Mm.
firm. He didn't mind getting in death's face, didn't mind getting in the devil's face. He would get nose to nose with them and say, I know you can hurt me. Go ahead, give me a swat. I know you can hurt me, but you can't keep me from going to the Emerald City.
Mm.
I'm going. So try to shut me up. You won't do it until the Lord sees fit to bring me home. That was his whole message.
Mm-hmm. That's so
So
good. That's so good. Well, one quick question,
sure.
and this is more of a teaser for the audience to go and maybe do some research. And I know you've done a lot of research on this, but tell us real quickly the potential role that near-death experiences have for resurrection studies. Are near-death experiences a legitimate topic of interest with respect to this topic itself?
Yeah, in one book of medical doctors who write on the subject,
Mm-hmm.
they start the book by estimating that 9 to 20 million people have had near-death experiences in the world today.
Mm.
Now, how about through history? Now, the point is, see, critics like to say to us, one of their most potent objections is, here's why my theory is better than yours. I only have this walk a day, live a day world, a real world of sticks and stones and trees. You have to have another world with God, and you've got no evidence for it. You just got this other world you stick in there. And if you don't have evidence for it, time up. I don't want to talk about the resurrection. Okay, time up. Let's talk about near-death experiences. Because those people, you can take the simplest ones, there's hundreds of them that are evidenced. A few dozen of them, their evidence, as far as we know, the person has no brain or heart beat or waves, and they report things that are true. Now, if you take a simple one, the person is on the operating table, and they come back up the top, and they're screaming at the doctor, top of their lungs, their spirit, I guess. Quit beating on my chest. I don't want to come back. Let me go. If you just let me go, I could go. I've seen enough to know I want to go here. I don't want to come back anymore. And they're shouting. And finally, the doctor does his job, and he's pounding and pushing, and the person comes back, and they're in a body full of cancer, and they're going to have to go through the process of death. Where were they that they were shouting at him? And I saw one cartoon, framed cartoon where the doctor stops and says to the person up above, are you going to come back down in the body, or am I going to pronounce you dead? Like as if he could hear the end of ear. But they don't hear the end of ear. Now, I don't know what you call it, but the end of ear is in another realm. And that's what critics say we don't have. They say we don't have another world that's attached to this one. But what NDEs say is there's an afterlife somewhere. We don't know where, but there's an afterlife. And so I say to critics, if I know there's an afterlife, that's the same realm that resurrection happens in. There's a straight line from Follow the Yellow Brick Road to afterlife. And probably the best indication of the afterlife, not counting the resurrection, is near-death experiences. And so if the NDEs open the back of the path to the Emerald City, resurrection opens the front of the path, they meet in the middle. Resurrection says there's afterlife. Resurrection says an afterlife. NDEs say there's an afterlife. They meet together, and that's the benefit of NDEs, to tell you there is another world, or at least another dimension. Say whatever you want. Mm-hmm. There's another dimension. It's called the afterlife. The resurrection ties in with this, and we not only have the NDE evidence, we have the resurrection evidence. So the path, that's for me. I tell people, yeah, I do resurrection and NDEs, but that's not two topics. That's one topic. It's resurrection to the Emerald City. That's the two combined. And that's why I think they're related, because they both tie together in the idea of the afterlife.
Yeah, they both announce that death, physical death, is not the final say, essentially.
Exactly. And why that person up above their body, very frequent. Why do they say to the doctor, quit beating on me, stop it, I want to move on, let me go? Why do they do that? Because where they can see they're heading is far better to them than the cancer-racked body that I know I'm going to die from in 6 months anyway. I'd rather just go right now. Just let me go. Okay, that sounds to now. How does that tie in? Philippians chapter 1 is, these are two of my favorite 5 verses in the New Testament. But Paul says, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. Verse 21. I tell people, I've heard a lot of sermons on to live as Christ. I've heard virtually no sermons on to die as gain. We don't talk about it. But Paul says it's gain. The 2 verses later, which I like even better, he says, I prefer to die and be with Christ, which is better by far. And you know the Greek way, 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 way more than I do. But I understand that word better by far, what we translate by far, it's an emphatic kind of like, I really mean it. It's really a lot better there. In fact, I read a translation once where the translation was, I prefer to die and be with Christ, which is better, comma, far better. That's how they translate that emphatic thing, usage. And it doesn't seem like Paul is saying similarly to what the NDE are saying. Leave me alone. I want to go home. I already see what I'm going to have. I want to go there. Hey, listen, I love you guys, but I know you're going to be with me too. So just let me go. Besides, who wants to go through what I have to go if I go back in the body? Whoops, I'm back in the body. You know, so it's a similar message. I'm not trying to say NDEs are, I'm not trying to do that stuff. Because NDEs don't tell us which religion is true. It's like intelligent design or arguments for God's existence. It just says some religion is true. But there's an afterlife, and the person wants to stay there, and Paul wants to stay there. And Paul seems to have had a near-death experience in 2 Corinthians 12. So, you know, by the way, Bible scholars, before NDEs became popular, I've got a couple of them, where they said the time element, he said, I knew a man 12 years ago. They said the time element works out pretty closely when he was in Lystra. And stoned and left for dead. Now, if that's true, that would all the more make 2 Corinthians 12 look like an NDE.
I've heard that too. For sure. It's really important that the listeners understand that, these near-death experiences, you're not making these up as like thought experiments. Like these are actually what you were talking about were based on actual reports that people have given and that are later verified by a third party, which is, they see something that there's no way that a body on a gurney should have been able to see. Right.
That's right. The stuff's in the medical, it's in the medical literature. There's a major guy, a good friend of mine, Bruce Grayson. He has published, I understand, 100, he's done way more than 100 articles, but he's done 100 essays in medical and psych journals. So if there's 100 articles from one guy in the journals, it's being taken pretty seriously. Hey, man, here's something for you. I just read this recently from an atheist. You probably know Michael Shermer. He's a really well-known atheist. He's the editor of the journal Skeptic. And he did a survey. And here's how he starts. He says, I don't know who did the survey, but he said in a recent survey, only surveying atheists and agnostics, someone asked the question, do you believe in an afterlife? Now, real quickly, I mean, philosophically, we would say, hey, y'all, if you believe in an afterlife, that doesn't come from your philosophy. But here's the surprising thing. 32% of them believed in an afterlife.
I remember you telling me that the other day.
It's inconsistent with their theory, but they want to go there.
It just goes to show that topic is hot for not just believers, right? But for a lot of people.
But it doesn't follow from their worldview. It's a contradiction.
Interesting.
So I think for believers that goes back to Philippians 1:21 and 23. It's a fantastic message.
It would present a challenge for philosophical naturalism, at least the sort that I know, that I'm aware of. Maybe they come up with a different.
No, I think you're right. I mean, here's the funny thing: a Buddhist, a Hindu, a Muslim, a Jew, and a Christian can stand shoulder to shoulder and affirm NDEs and an afterlife, and not know which one is true from NDEs because NDE doesn't prove any of them. But here's what they all agree on: naturalism is false.
That's good. That's good.
And with it, of course, atheism is a subcategory. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, tell us when your book's going to be out. Is it next year? Is it this year?
the first volume is due out if there's no delays. Right now, we're on target.
Hmm.
It's due out this coming January. It's a long way away. It's due this next January,
Oh, that's right.
24.
Yeah. And
January 24.
do you have a working title? Is that something you can share? Or?
No, you know what? Oh, I'd share it in a heartbeat if I knew it.
Okay.
But around the I don't know if they intend that. I don't know. They call the set the resurrection,
Hmm.
and they call the first book the evidence. They
Okay.
call the
Cool.
second book uh, alternative theories, because not all of them are naturalistic. Alternative theories, and so they're doing that, like real simple titles, like
Sure.
resurrection evidence, resurrection alternative theories, and we're moving on to the last two volumes.
Oh, very good. Gary, it is always a pleasure to talk with you, and today is no exception. I just really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for hanging out with us.
Oh, Matt, your knowledge is great. I love talking to you for that reason. In fact, your people don't know this, but Matt's one of the three New Testament scholars who reviewed two of my chapters. I can't take that stuff on my own. I mean, I have a Greek minor, which I tell people doesn't make me good. That makes me dangerous. I can't do Greek like that. Oh, by the way, the fellow who's editing my book, what they told me, I got to check this out. The guy's got a PhD in Semitics, and when he goes through he changes all my titles, like Josephus, the life, or wars. He changes all the titles to the Latin exact. The exact titles are called in scholarly work. So he put together my scholarly index at the beginning, where all the sources I use, and he put the page numbers. But he did it. He did the index with all the good titles instead of Habermas saying Suetonius, Julius Caesar 14. He does the abbreviations that are used in classical literature. So,
That's his home territory. It's second
well,
nature
but I
for him,
mean,
I guess, so
between
right?
you and the other two New Testament guys who did two chapters each, and now this guy who I've never met, but he's my editor of the whole thing. He's doing all four volumes, editing them. The Lord has just given me a great team, and you were one of them. You were one of the guys to go through this, and I'm eternally grateful for what y'all have done.
That was a pleasure. I enjoy those two chapters, and I can't wait for the whole set. I'll be the first one to
I
get it,
can't
so that's so
either. I
good.
can't
Yeah,
wait myself.
I know. You need to go on vacation once that thing hits the shelves, right?
I do. But my
Yeah.
wife and I can't figure out where we want to go, because all our grandkids, 16 of them, all live in this town.
Oh yeah.
And what my
Yeah.
wife would say? Well, there's a solution. Take them all with us.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. Go to the beach, have some fun. That's
There
great.
you go.
Well, Gary, blessings to you and your
Thank
ministry.
you,
Thanks
Matt.
for hanging out.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.